Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I've always liked walking at night, even when common sense says I shouldn't. There's something about the stillness up here in the Appalachians that feels cleaner than the day, like the mountains finally exhale once the sun drops behind the ridgeline. My name's Jack Mercer. I'm 58 now, born and raised in these hills. I spent most of my life welding for a mining outfit and fixing busted machinery in dusty garages until my body decided it had taken enough sparks and metal shavings. These days I live alone in an old clapboard house that's perched halfway up a ridge, a little ways off a county road that barely sees traffic after dark. It's just me and my dog, a big red mutt named Rusty, who's got more patience for me than I probably deserve. The house is too big for one man, with creaking floors and too many doors, but I couldn't bring myself to sell it after my wife Elise passed. We built a life in these rooms, argued in this kitchen, danced once or twice in the living room when some song we both liked came on the radio. When cancer took her, the walls didn't feel like walls anymore. They felt like an echo chamber. My kids are grown and gone to their own lives in bigger towns. They call when they can, but at the end of the day, it's just me, Rusty, and the mountain air. One night, after a long day in my workshop out back patching up a neighbor's busted trailer frame, I decided to take my usual loop around the property. I've got about 30 acres of woods and scrub wrapping around the hill like a crooked horseshoe, with an old barn slumping off to one side and a gravel drive that climbs up from the road below. The air was cool enough to sting a little when I breathed in, and Rusty padded along at my side, his collar tags clicking softly in the dark. I've walked that loop hundreds of times past the tool shed, around the barn, along the tree line where the forest gets thick and the ground falls away toward the creek far below. It's routine, familiar, the kind of thing you do without thinking. But as I rounded back toward the house that night, something snagged at the corner of my vision and brought everything to a stop. I looked up at the second floor window that faces the ridge, the one that used to belong to the bedroom Elise and I shared. The light was off, but for just a fraction of a second, I could have sworn I saw movement. Not a shadow, not a trick of the branches, but something shifting just out of sight. I stopped dead on the path. A cold line ran down my back. No one had any business being in that room. I hadn't stepped foot in there much since the funeral. Her clothes, her books on the nightstand, even the old quilt she loved, it all became a kind of shrine I wasn't ready to dismantle. It was easier to close the door and sleep in the smaller bedroom across the hall like a guest in my own house. But now, looking up at that dark window, all I could think was that someone was in there. Not a memory, not grief, but a person. I felt my jaw clench, heat rising in my chest. There's a special kind of anger that comes when you think someone's violated the one place you still feel halfway safe. I marched up to the porch, Rusty pacing uncertainly beside me, and yanked open the front door so hard it rattled the frame. Inside, the house smelled like old coffee and sawdust. My heartbeat was loud in my ears as I took the stairs, two at a time, the wood groaning under my weight. I flung the bedroom door open. Nothing. The room was just as it left it, curtains half drawn, dust on the dresser, the old quilt folded at the foot of the bed. The air had that stale, closed-off smell, like no one had breathed in there in years. I searched anyway. Under the bed, in the closet, behind the old cedar chest. I even stepped into the narrow little closet where Elise kept her dresses, the faint trace of her perfume long gone. There was no one. I stood there feeling foolish and strangely exposed, like the intruder was me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been disturbed. That's when I noticed the first detail that really unnerved me, the layer of dust on the dresser. Right in the middle of it, there was a clean streak, the width of a hand, like someone had rested their palm there to lean in closer to the mirror. The rest of the dust lay untouched. I stared at that smudge for a long time, telling myself I must have brushed it earlier without noticing. Then I remembered I hadn't touched that dresser in years. I tried to swallow the unease and wrote it off as my brain making patterns out of nothing. I went to bed that night a little on edge. But by the time I lay down in the spare room with Rusty snoring softly beside the bed, exhaustion pulled me under. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up to a low growl. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, until I realized it was Rusty. Has not a yappy dog. He almost never makes a sound unless there's a good reason. His growl rumbled from the darkness, low and steady. I pushed myself up on one elbow and listened. That's when I heard it. A faint creaking from upstairs, just above my head. Old houses make noises, especially ones perched on a mountain where the wind shifts and the temperature drops fast after sunset. I've heard all the regular complaints of this place. The settling pops, the whine of boards, the occasional scuttle of some critter in the walls. But this wasn't random. This was rhythmic, careful, like the slow weight of footfalls crossing the bedroom above me, the bedroom that had no reason to be occupied by anyone. Every creak seemed to land like a heartbeat. The ceiling felt thinner than it ever had. I thought about grabbing the hunting rifle I keep locked in the safe downstairs, but some stubborn part of me resisted the idea of needing a gun in my own house. I told myself that if it came to it, I could handle whoever was there with my own two hands. I slid quietly out of bed, grabbed the heavy flashlight from the nightstand, and crept into the hall. The stairs moaned with each step, and I tried to match my own weight to the sound of the house so I wouldn't stand out. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched ahead, dark and narrow. The door to our old bedroom was closed, though I was almost sure he'd left it cracked earlier. My throat felt dry as I reached out and turned the knob. The door swung open with a soft squeal. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room, slicing through dust motes and faded wallpaper. Empty. The bed was neatly made, just as it had been. The curtains lifted slightly in the draft from an old, leaky window, casting thin shadows on the floor. I checked under every piece of furniture again. Nothing. But when I stepped back into the hall, my light caught something I couldn't explain. Down the hall, near the attic access panel, a faint set of footprints smeared across the worn wooden boards. They were darker than the floor, as if someone had tracked in damp dirt. The prints were small, narrow, bare. They stopped right beneath the hatch that led to the attic, which was shut tight with the old brass latch flipped down. It looked untouched, but those prints weren't mine. My own work boots were sitting dry and dusty by the door. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, the beam of the flashlight trembling just enough to make the shadows seem alive, telling myself I was misreading stains that had always been there. Rusty was at the bottom of the stairs, hackles raised, eyes fixed on me like he expected me to do something decisive. Eventually, I backed away, went downstairs, and stayed awake on the couch until the sky turned from black to gray. The next night, things escalated. I went through my usual routine, double-checked the doors, turned off the lights, made sure the workshop was locked. I'm not careless. Out here, you can't afford to be. I remember clicking off the kitchen light and standing for a second at the sink, looking out at the dark bulk of the tree line, trying not to imagine someone standing just beyond the porch, watching. I told myself I was getting paranoid. I went to bed and managed a few hours of sleep. When I came downstairs the next morning, the kitchen light was blazing. Every cabinet door was slightly ajar, like someone had opened them and then half-heartedly closed them again. On the counter by the coffee maker, my mug was sitting out, empty, even though I always leave it upside down to keep dust out. Next to it lay my house keys, which I keep on a hook by the back door, never tossed on the counter where anyone could grab them. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't left things like that. It felt like seeing your handwriting on a note you don't remember writing. There was no question in my mind anymore. Someone had been moving through my house at night like it belonged to them. I checked every room, my pulse hammering. The attic hatch was still latched. The doors and windows were all locked from the inside. It didn't matter. I called the sheriff's department and told them I thought someone had been creeping around the property, maybe even inside. 2 deputies drove up the ridge later that day, their cruiser crunching on my gravel drive. They were polite, took it seriously enough to walk the house, check the windows, shine their flashlights up into the attic. They didn't find anything except some old boxes, a broken fan, in a mouse nest. Out by the tree line, one of them bent down and pointed out some boot prints in the soft earth near the edge of my property. Too big to be mine, too recent to be old. That was enough to validate that I wasn't completely losing it, but not enough for them to do much more than tell me to lock my doors and call if I saw anything again. I could tell by their faces they chalked a lot of this up to an aging man alone on a mountain with too much time to think and too many memories rattling around in his head. That night, I decided to push through the fear instead of letting it simmer. I hadn't been in my old bedroom since the initial scare, and some stubborn part of me wanted to reclaim it. Maybe I thought that if I forced myself to walk into that room and prove nothing was wrong, the knot in my chest would finally loosen. Around midnight, exhausted and restless, I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs again. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. I opened the bedroom door and froze solid. The bed was a mess, covers thrown back like someone had just climbed out of it. Elise's clothes, dresses I'd carefully packed into boxes years ago were scattered across the floor, some laid out on the bedspread as if someone had been sorting through them. Those boxes, which I knew had been stacked neatly in the closet, now sat open by the window, flaps bent and torn. It felt like walking into a crime scene built specifically to hurt me. I swallowed hard and stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight roaming over every surface. On the nightstand, where there used to be a faded photo of Elise and me at the county fair, there was now something else. A folded piece of paper, lined, torn from a notebook. My name was written on the outside, in shaky, unfamiliar handwriting. I didn't open it right away. My skin crawled just knowing someone had stood in this exact spot, close enough to my life to know my name, close enough to my grief to dig through her clothes. That was horror detail number one I couldn't explain away. When I finally unfolded the note, my hands shook. There weren't many words, just a short sentence that made my stomach twist. I've been here longer than you think. No signature, no threat, just that. My first instinct wasn't fear. It was rage. Every nerve in my body lit up. I spun toward the doorway, half expecting to see someone standing there. That's when I caught sight of a figure in the hallway, small, slight, the outline of a woman framed in the gloom. She stood perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't see her face, just the pale oval of it and the dark fall of her hair. But I could tell immediately she wasn't Elise. The height was wrong, the posture wrong, the whole presence wrong. This was a stranger standing in the heart of my life. Without thinking, I charged. The rational part of my brain had already checked out. All that was left was the animal instinct not to be prey in my own home. She spun and fled, bare feet slapping the floorboards as she bolted down the hallway, down the stairs, through the living room. I chased her, my shoulder clipping the wall, Rusty barking wildly from below as he caught sight of us. By the time I burst out onto the porch, the night air knifing my lungs, she was already sprinting across the yard toward the tree line. Her shadow stretched long in the porch light. I ran after her, but I'm not 25 anymore, and the ground here is uneven, full of holes and roots. I lost sight of her among the laurel and rhododendron. Rusty tore around, nose to the ground. But after a frantic search, with my flashlight cutting across trunks and branches, it was as if the mountain had swallowed her. No broken twigs, no obvious path, just silence. That should have been the end of it, but what really set my heart racing came a little later, when I circled back toward the barn. The padlock on the barn door, which I always keep locked, hung open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old hay, but there was something else layered in stale cigarette smoke and the faint, sour scent of unwashed clothes. In one corner, on top of a stack of old feed bags, I found a makeshift bed, a ratty blanket, a flattened pillow, and a small pile of food wrappers, beef jerky, crackers, a cheap canned soup with the top peeled back. Beside it sat an empty water bottle and, worst of all, my own spare work jacket folded neatly as if it belonged there. I hadn't worn that jacket in months. I'd left it hanging in the barn without thinking about it. Now it was part of someone's nest. That was horror detail number 2. She hadn't just passed through my life. Shed moved into it, quietly, invisibly, setting up camp 50 yards from my bedroom window. That night, I didn't sleep at all. For weeks afterward, sleep came in fits, if it came at all. Every small sound, a branch scraping the siding, the heater kicking on, Rusty shifting in his sleep sent my heart pounding. I started keeping my rifle leaned against the wall by my bed, loaded and ready. I triple-checked the locks. I nailed shut a few old basement windows I'd never paid much attention to before. I even rigged up some makeshift noise traps on the porch with a few tin cans and fishing line, just in case. Living that way does something to your mind. You start to feel like your own heartbeat is too loud, like your thoughts could give you away. One night, after weeks of this silent war, I was sitting in my worn recliner in the living room. The TV was on, volume low, just for company. Rusty lay curled at my feet, his head resting on my boot. Outside, the mountain was a dark, unmoving wall pressed against the windows. I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye and turned my head toward the big front window. At first, I thought I was seeing my own reflection, warped by the glass and the light from the TV. But then I realized my reflection doesn't stand still on the outside of the house. She was there again. A slim figure in a dark hoodie, standing just beyond the edge of the porch light, facing the window. I couldn't see her face, just the suggestion of it under the hood. But I could feel her attention like a physical thing. For a heartbeat, it was dead quiet. Even Rusty seemed to hold his breath. Then adrenaline slammed into me. I grabbed the rifle, tore the door open, and stepped out onto the porch, yelling something wordless that was more a raw sound than language. I fired a warning shot up into the air, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, the sound rolling off the hills. She flinched, turned, and ran. This time I didn't chase her into the woods. I've lived here long enough to know better than to go crashing blindly into mountain darkness after someone desperate enough to stalk. My goal wasn't to catch her. It was to let her know that I was done being passive. As the echo of the shot faded, the quiet that followed felt heavier than anything I'd ever experienced. I stood there on the porch, breath steaming in the cold air, listening for any crack of a twig, any rustle of movement. Nothing. Just the high, distant hum of the highway way down in the valley and the close, oppressive silence of the pines. When I went back inside and locked the door, my hands were still shaking. I told myself that would be enough to scare her off for good, that no one with any sense would keep testing a man willing to shoot into the night. But people who crawl into your empty rooms and sleep in your barn don't always operate on regular sense. A few days later, I discovered the third thing, the detail that still wakes me up in a cold sweat. I was in the workshop out back, sorting through a drawer of old tools, when I knocked over an old metal tin. It clattered to the floor and popped open, spilling its contents, a small stack of Polaroid photos I hadn't taken. The first one was of my house, shot from the tree line, the porch light, a soft glow against the dark. The second was of the barn. The third was of the side of the house, zoomed in on a second-floor window, my window. In that one, you could see me as a faint silhouette behind the curtains, sitting at my desk, head bent, completely unaware. My throat tightened. Mixed in with the photos was a single earplug, the kind you'd wear at a shooting range, and a tiny plastic charm shaped like a heart. I realized then that she hadn't just been inside my house or sleeping in my barn. She had been studying me, learning my patterns, standing out there in the dark with a cheap camera in her hands while I went about my life thinking I was alone. Those pictures were horror detail number 3. And they were all I needed to understand that whatever this was, it was premeditated, targeted, human. I brought the photos to the sheriff's office, laid them out on the desk. This time, they didn't look at me like I was just a lonely man chasing ghosts. They took statements, asked questions, promised to send a patrol up the ridge more often. They mentioned there'd been reports in neighboring counties of a woman drifting through, breaking into empty cabins and hunting camps, sometimes staying for days without the owners knowing. No one had gotten close enough to really pin her down. It didn't make me feel better. Knowing there might be others didn't make sharing my home with a stranger any less terrifying. It's been months since I last saw her silhouette in the yard. Sometimes I think she's gone for good, maybe moved on to some other forgotten hollow. Other times, when the wind presses against the windows just right, or Rusty lifts his head in the middle of the night and stares at the door. I'm sure she's out there still, watching, waiting for an opportunity. I'm prepared to defend myself, as much as any man can be. The rifle is never far, the doors are always locked, and the noise traps still hang from the porch railings like a strange wind chime. Only I understand. But living in a constant state of readiness isn't really living. It's pacing inside your own skin, waiting for a sound that may or may not come. In the middle of all of it, Rusty has been my anchor, warm, solid, alive. Something that depends on me and loves me back without asking for explanations. Sometimes I sit on the porch with him pressed against my leg, watching the last light fade behind the ridge, and I wonder how many nights she might have stood exactly where I'm sitting now, looking in instead of out. I don't have some neat lesson or brave conclusion to wrap this up with. This is just what happened, as best as I can tell it, and I'm still living inside the after. If you've ever dealt with something like this, or if you think you have any idea what might drive a person to crawl into someone else's grief and make a home there, I'd honestly be curious to hear it in the comments. Maybe it'll make me feel a little less like I'm out here on this ridge fighting shadows all by myself. Story 2. I work for a catering company based out of a little mountain town in the Appalachians. The kind of place where the Walmart closes earlier than it should and the hills swallow the horizon in every direction. My life is a lot of late nights and long drives on narrow 2-lane roads that twist around the ridges like they were laid down by hand. Most weekends, I'm hauling food and equipment to weddings in hollowed-out barns or corporate retreats at cabins that pretend to be rustic but have better Wi-Fi than my apartment. I drive a big box truck for the company, and by the time I finally get to climb into my own car at the end of a shift, my body feels hollowed out and buzzing from too much caffeine and not enough real food. That night was one of those nights. It was a Tuesday going on Wednesday, somewhere around 2 in the morning, and I was finally off the interstate, winding my way along the dark ribbon of road that cut through the foothills toward my place. My name's Aaron, by the way, 26. Tired more often than not, and definitely not where I thought it'd be in life. But that's a whole different story. I remember staring at the dashed lines on the asphalt, my eyes gritty, feeling that familiar, jittery tension in my veins that comes from too many energy drinks and hours of fluorescent light. I knew even before I pulled off the exit that there was no way I was falling asleep anytime soon. On top of that, my stomach was a knotted, empty pit. Somewhere between setting up chafing dishes and tearing down centerpieces, it'd skipped dinner entirely. There's a 24-hour fast food place just off the highway, down near the valley where the interstate flattens out, technically a McDonald's, but ours sits wedged between a truck stop and a gas station with flickering lights, cradled by the mountains on both sides. It's about 15 minutes from my apartment if there's no traffic, and it's become my default stop when I get off too late to cook. I pulled off onto the exit ramp, watching the orange glow from the truck stop bleed into the fog that hung low over the parking lots. As I merged onto the little access road, I noticed a car behind me in the mirror, a beat-up dark Volkswagen sedan with one headlight slightly dimmer than the other. It had been behind me for a while, I realized, matching my speed on the interstate, dropping back when I changed lanes and then sliding in behind me again, always at the same distance. I hadn't thought much of it out on the highway. Out here, you see the same handful of cars for miles. But as we both curved off the exit and the mountains pulled back to make room for the lights of the valley, something about seeing that same car in my rear view again made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was just another late-night driver who happened to be going the same way. People overlap routes all the time. Still, my grip on the steering wheel tightened without my say-so. When I turned into the McDonald's lot, the Volkswagen kept going at first, rolling past the entrance like it was headed toward the truck stop. I actually felt a flicker of relief, the kind you don't acknowledge until it's already there. I pulled into the drive-through lane and settled in behind a couple of cars, wondering why it was so busy at that hour. That's when I noticed the Volkswagen again. It had turned around somewhere and was now backed into the far corner of the parking lot, away from the lights, facing out toward the road. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see a silhouette behind the glass. The engine was off. No dome light, no movement, just a dark, beaten car sitting in the one patch of shadow the floodlights didn't quite reach. My brain immediately tried to rationalize. Maybe someone was just eating in their car. Maybe a trucker catching some sleep without spending money on a motel. People do weird, harmless things at 2 in the morning. But the lot was mostly empty, except for the drive-through line. And in a town this small, anything that breaks the usual pattern feels strange by default. As the line crawled forward, I found myself staring at that car instead of the glowing menu board. I realized I couldn't remember if I'd seen it pull into the lot. At one point, my eyes drifted away and landed on a flyer taped crookedly to the front door, a missing person notice with a girl's face blurred by distance and darkness. For a second, my heart did a small, irrational flip. Then the car in front of me rolled up to the window, the speaker crackled to life, and the spell broke. I ordered the usual, nothing crazy, just enough food to quiet the hunger and justify being there. When I finally got my bag and pulled away, I checked my mirror again. The Volkswagen was still there. No lights, no movement, just existing in the corner, like a bad feeling you can't quite name. My apartment complex is a straight shot from that parking lot, maybe 10 easy minutes up a road that climbs back into the low hills. But the thought of going straight home to the quiet, empty space didn't appeal to me. I was wired, restless, and the idea of sitting alone in my dark living room with my brain still spinning sounded like the worst possible option. 10 minutes from my place, there's a small state preserve built around an old coal strip mine that nature has been slowly reclaiming. The locals just call it Black Bear Preserve, mostly because black bears show up in the parking lot every other summer looking for trash. During the day, families hike the trails and teenagers take pictures at the Overlook, a wide concrete platform built at the edge of what used to be a cut into the mountain. From up there, you can see the whole valley, a scatter of house lights, the snake of the highway, the way the ridges stack up like waves in the distance. At night, when the park is technically closed and the gate to the upper road is locked, you can still park outside the entrance in a gravel pull-off and walk up the paved service road to the Overlook. I used to go there all the time in high school with my friend Tyler and a few others, just to sit on the low barrier wall, talk about nothing, and pretend we weren't terrified of the future. I hadn't been up there in a while, but that night it sounded perfect. Silent, open air, a view that always managed to make my problems feel a little smaller. I drove out there with the bag of food steaming up the car, my headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the dark. The road to the preserve peeled off from the main 2-lane and climbed up the side of the ridge, then bent sharply into a rough gravel lot. When I pulled in, the place was completely empty, just as I expected. No other cars, no ranger trucks, only the shape of the locked gate up ahead and the forest pressing in on 3 sides. I parked facing the entrance, halfway between the road and the tree line, and cut the engine. The sudden quiet felt heavy after the hum of the interstate. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine, the distant hiss of the highway below, and the faint whisper of wind in the trees. I was just about to unwrap my burger when I saw headlights swing across the lot. A car turned in, tires crunching on gravel. As it angled toward the far side, my stomach dropped. It was the same dark Volkswagen, the same one that had been sitting in the corner of the McDonald's lot, the same one that had trailed me on the interstate. I watched it park, again backing into the farthest corner, this time facing the woods instead of the road. The lights went out. The interior stayed dark. No one got out. It just sat there. I told myself this had to be a coincidence, that maybe I was being self-absorbed to think a random car was somehow involved with me. People follow similar routes all the time, especially at night in a place where there are only so many places to go. Still, the quiet in the car turned brittle. The gravel lot felt a lot smaller than it had a minute earlier. I realized I didn't want to be there alone anymore. I grabbed my phone and FaceTimed Tyler, who lived about 10 minutes away and kept terrible sleep habits, even on weekdays. He actually answered, bleary-eyed but awake, said he'd been working on grad school stuff and was planning to pull an all-nighter anyway. I told him where I was and asked if he wanted to hang out at the Overlook for a bit. I tried to make it sound casual, but there must have been something in my voice, because he didn't ask many questions. He just said he'd be there soon. While I waited, I kept my eyes mostly on my food and the gate ahead, pretending I couldn't feel the weight of that car behind me. Every now and then I glanced in the rearview. The Volkswagen remained dark and still, like an abandoned shell. At one point, when I looked back, I thought I saw the faintest flicker of a phone screen inside. A small rectangle of blue light that vanished as soon as I focused on it. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I didn't. About 10 minutes later, twin beams of headlights cut into the lot, and Tyler's hatchback pulled up. I felt my entire body unclench, just seeing someone I trusted step out into the night. We said a few quick words, that half-whispered banter people fall into automatically at night, and then started up the paved road toward the Overlook, our steps echoing softly. Before the parking lot disappeared from view behind the bend, I turned back for one last look. The Volkswagen was still there. Then, all at once, all 4 doors opened. 4 guys climbed out, all in dark hoodies, silhouetted against the faint glow from the highway below. They didn't talk, didn't laugh, didn't even gesture at each other. They just stood there for a few seconds, facing different directions, like they were listening, deciding. A cold, metallic feeling slid under my skin. I nudged Tyler, and he followed my gaze. The 2 of us didn't say anything, but our pace quickened on its own, and we let the curve of the road and the trees swallow the view of the lot. Up at the Overlook, the world opened up. The concrete platform jutted out into the dark where the old mine had been, and the valley stretched endlessly below us, lit by scattered clusters of house lights and the thin, glowing line of the interstate. The sky was overcast, but clear enough that we could see the faintest smudge of stars. We sat on the low stone wall that was supposed to keep people from wandering too close to the edge, and unwrapped our food, the smell of salt and grease oddly comforting in the cold air. For a little while, the conversation and the view did what he had hoped they would. I forgot about the Volkswagen. I forgot about the strange timing. I was just tired, hungry, and grateful not to be alone. Then the sound of voices drifted up the path. Male voices, laughing in that loose, careless way people do when they've been drinking or smoking. The laughter got louder as footsteps scuffed up the pavement. Tyler and I turned to see 3 guys walking toward us. All 3 wore hoodies, with the hoods up, their faces shadowed. One of them held what looked like a blunt between his fingers, taking slow, deliberate drags as he walked, the ember flaring orange in the dark. They weren't overtly aggressive. If anything, their body language was relaxed, almost too casual, like they'd walked this path 1,000 times. But they didn't pick another spot on the platform or give us space. They came right up to us, close enough that I could smell the mix of weed, sweat, and something sharper chemical, metallic like motor oil or cleaning solvent clinging to their clothes. The guy with the blunt looked like their leader. He was tall and wiry, his hands covered in small scars and fresh scrapes. When he shifted his weight, his hoodie rode up just enough for me to see a McDonald's uniform shirt underneath, the bright colors muted in the darkness, and a cheap plastic name tag flipped backwards so I couldn't read it. Clipped to his belt loop, half hidden by the sweatshirt, was a box cutter, the kind we used all the time at the catering warehouse. The sight of it shouldn't have been remarkable on its own, but out there, on the edge of an abandoned strip mine at 2 a.m, it sent a sharp little pulse of dread through me. He gave us a thin, almost friendly smile and asked if we wanted a hit. We both declined, more politely than either of us actually felt. One of the other guys snorted and muttered something under his breath that I pretended not to hear. The air shifted. I could feel Tyler tensing beside me. I don't know why I asked what I did next. Maybe it was nerves, or curiosity, or the part of my brain that always wants to make sense of things. I mentioned offhand that I'd seen their car at the McDonald's, sitting in the corner of the lot. The guy with the blunt lost his smile like someone had flipped a switch. His eyes narrowed just a fraction, and his 2 friends went quiet, their attention sharpening in a way that made my heart rate kick up. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. The wind tugged at the edge of my jacket. Somewhere down in the valley, a truck horn blared faintly. In that silence, I remembered very clearly that there had been 4 doors opening in the parking lot. 4 guys getting out. Only 3 stood in front of us now. That realization settled over me like ice water. I saw the same awareness flicker across Tyler's face. Eventually, The leader shrugged and said something about working nights and needing a place to unwind after his shift. He tugged his hoodie up to show the uniform more clearly, as if that proved he was harmless. He said he and his friends came up here all the time, that it was kind of their spot. There was nothing overtly threatening in his words, but the whole encounter felt wrong. The way they stood just a little too close. The way their eyes kept flicking past us, toward the trees that ringed the platform. After another beat of strained small talk, I looked at Tyler and knew we were both thinking the same thing. It was time to go. We tossed our trash into a nearby bin and headed back down the path, walking a little faster than before. The moment we left the circle of the Overlook's open space and stepped into the narrower corridor of trees, the darkness seemed to close in around us. The path ahead was clear, lit only by the faint gray wash of the sky, but my skin prickled like we were being watched. About halfway down, Tyler stopped suddenly and touched my arm, his grip just a little too tight. He nodded toward the tree line on our right. At first, I didn't see anything, just the black shape of trunks and branches. Then my eyes adjusted, and I realized there was a figure standing just inside the line of trees. The fourth guy. He was half hidden in shadow, his hoodie blending into the dark, his face indistinguishable. What I could see clearly was his hands. In one of them, he held something long and rigid, angled slightly toward the ground. It could have been a crowbar, or a broken-off piece of rebar, or maybe a tire iron, the kind of thing you could explain away if you were inclined to. My brain tried to label it in 100 harmless ways. My body reacted first. The instant he realized we'd seen him, he shifted his weight like he was about to step out onto the path. That was all it took. We ran. I don't mean we hurried or speed walked. We bolted down that paved road, our footsteps hammering the ground, breath burning in our chests. Behind us, I heard the sudden thud of more feet hitting the pavement. The rough voices of the guys from the Overlook shouting at each other to hurry up, their footsteps closing the distance. For a few seconds, I had the disorienting sensation of being back in high school, sprinting down this same road for some stupid reason, only this time there was nothing playful about it. This time there was the sound of more than one person chasing us, and the distinct metallic clink of something heavy being dragged or carried behind them. I didn't dare look back. The parking lot appeared like a dark, blessed opening ahead. We sprinted for our cars, splitting without even needing to coordinate, each heading to our own. As I grabbed my door handle, I noticed a long, fresh scratch gouged into the paint along the driver's side, thin and jagged, running from the back panel almost to the front wheel well. I had washed my car that afternoon. That mark had not been there. In that split second, I had a clear, nauseating thought. At some point while I'd been sitting up at the Overlook, someone had been down here, close enough to reach out and drag metal along the side of my car. I fumbled my keys, somehow got the door open, and threw myself inside. Tyler's engine roared to life across the lot. Mine followed a second later. I slammed the locks, shifted into reverse, and backed out so fast the gravel spit under my tires. As I turned toward the exit, I saw the four guys spill down onto the pavement at the edge of the lot, silhouettes against the faint glow from the road. One of them started toward my car, but I was already moving. I hit the gas and pulled onto the main road without looking back, my heart slamming so hard I could feel it in my throat. Tyler's headlights appeared in my rear view as he peeled out behind me. For a few miles, my eyes kept darting to the mirror, half expecting to see the Volkswagen's one dim headlight stack up behind us. Nothing. Just empty road and the distant glow of the valley dropping away behind us. I knew I didn't want to go straight home. Didn't want to lead anyone who might be following us right to my front door. I called Tyler on speaker, my voice still shaking, and told him to meet on his street instead, where we could loop around and see if we were being tailed. We drove separate routes with a couple of extra turns, the way you do when you think someone might be behind you but don't want to be obvious. As far as we could tell, no one followed. On his street, which is quiet even by small-town standards, we parked for a while and just sat in our cars facing each other, both of us processing in stunned, disjointed fragments what had just happened. Tyler showed me a picture head snapped at the Overlook while they were distracted, a quick, shaky phone photo of the three guys standing there, hoods up, faces barely visible but distinct enough to recognize. At the time, I didn't know what to do with that. I just knew I didn't want to pretend this had all been some harmless misunderstanding. The next day, after a few hours of restless non-sleep, I called Tyler and convinced him to come with me back to the McDonald's. I didn't want to show up alone. We went in during the day, when the place looked completely ordinary. Kids chewing on fries, retirees nursing coffees, the mountains outside the windows washed in bright afternoon light. We asked to speak to a manager and ended up talking to a guy who looked to be maybe in his early 30s, with the kind of tired eyes that said he'd seen more drama in that little store than anyone would guess. We showed him the photo on Tyler's phone and briefly explained what had happened at the Overlook and about the Volkswagen in the lot. As soon as he saw the guy in the uniform, something in his expression tightened. He told us the man in the picture used to work there, that his name was Logan, and that he'd been fired a few months back after his ex-girlfriend, another employee, got a restraining order against him. Apparently, Logan hadn't taken the breakup well. He'd started showing up during her shifts, sitting in his car in the lot for hours, watching her through the windows, waiting for her to go on break. He'd followed her home more than once, texted her constantly from new numbers when she blocked him, left notes on her windshield when she stopped responding altogether. The manager said the police had been called multiple times, and eventually the restraining order went through, but that hadn't stopped Logan from parking in the far corner of the lot at night, technically just outside of what anyone could call harassment unless he stepped inside. The manager had kicked him out personally more than once. Hearing that, all of the separate eerie details from the night before snapped into a sharper shape. The car trailing me on the interstate, the way it had hung back just enough to be forgettable, the way it had reappeared at the preserve, the scratch on my car door, the hidden fourth guy in the trees. The manager said they'd already sent security footage to the police more than once, trying to prove he was violating the order. He took down our names and numbers and said we should probably call the sheriff's department ourselves to file a report about what happened at Black Bear Overlook. When we left, I noticed the missing person flyer still taped to the door. The same girl's face I'd seen the night before in the glow of my headlights, her smile frozen above a line that said "Last seen leaving work late," still in her uniform. I don't know if that had anything to do with Logan. I don't know if I want to know. It's been a little while since all of this went down, but I still haven't gone back to that McDonald's or up to the preserve after dark. I catch myself checking my mirrors more than I used to, paying extra attention to cars that seem to linger behind me on the highway. Sometimes, when I park at night, I walk a slow circle around my car just to check for fresh scratches, for signs that someone has been close enough to touch the things I take for granted as mine. At home, I double-check the locks, even though I live on the second floor. Part of me feels silly, like I've let one incident get under my skin too deeply. Another part of me keeps replaying the sound of those footsteps on the pavement, the way those four doors opened in unison, the way that long scratch gleamed raw and silver in the dim light of the Overlook parking lot. I don't know exactly what those guys had planned for us that night, and I'm not sure I want all the details. I just know that having a friend there, having someone else to run with, probably changed the way that story ended. If you've ever had a moment where a random encounter suddenly turned dark like that, or if you've ever realized too late that someone was watching you more closely than you realized, I'm honestly curious what you did and how you handled it, so if you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments. Maybe hearing how other people got through their close calls will make nights in these mountains feel a little less haunted by the things that almost happened. Story 3. Forgive me if I don't remember every single detail. This happened a long time ago, and time has a way of sanding the sharp edges off certain memories while leaving others razor clean. I grew up in a small town tucked into the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of place where the same 3 trucks circle Main Street on a Friday night, and everyone knows who your grandparents are before they learn your first name. There wasn't a whole lot to do when we were teenagers, so we made our own excitement, driving back roads with the windows down, daring each other to jump off the old train trestle into the creek, and, more than anything, sneaking into abandoned places that the adults in town pretended not to see. We called it exploring, but if I'm honest, we were chasing that thin line between fear and thrill, the jolt you get when your flashlight cuts across a room that no one's supposed to be in anymore. The place that stuck with me more than any other was an old abandoned church out in a hollow off a forgotten mining road maybe 15 minutes from town if you knew exactly where to turn. The road narrowed to a one-lane strip of broken asphalt and then to gravel, then finally just dirt, winding between black pines and rusted-out trailers, until it dead-ended at the church. It sat behind a sagging chain-link fence on a bit of flat ground carved out of the slope, its white paint long since peeled away, leaving gray wood exposed like bone. Someone had spray-painted crude crosses and nonsense words on the siding over the years, and one of the bell tower windows had been busted out, leaving a dark, empty square staring down at the hollow. We'd been there a couple of times before, always at night, when the world shrank to the circle of our flashlights and the crunch of our own footsteps. But this particular night is the one I can't shake. There were 6 of us. Me, my best friend at the time, Liam, and the rest of our usual group, Mara, who was fearless until she wasn't, twins Kayla and Jenna, and a lanky kid named Travis who laughed too loud when he was nervous. It was late fall, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible and your hands ache if you keep them out of your pockets too long. The woods around the church were bare, all the leaves fallen, so the branches reached up like a web of black veins against the sky. We parked a little ways down the road, killed the headlights, and walked up the slope in half-whispered conversation that faded as the church came into view. The fence around it was about 8 feet tall, but it bowed inward in places where others had climbed before us. The official entrances were all boarded up. The heavy double doors at the front were nailed shut with weathered plywood, and someone had slapped a no trespassing sign on top of that, more for liability than protection. We always got in the same way, through a broken side window where the glass had long since fallen out. The fence rattled when we climbed, cold metal biting our palms. On the other side, we dropped into brittle grass and patches of bare dirt. As we approached the window, beams from our flashlights swept across something that made me hesitate for the first time that night. A weather-beaten plastic lawn chair set up just outside the wall, facing the trees, with a crushed soda can resting on the seat and a worn-out blanket folded on the ground beside it. It wasn't old junk. The aluminum glinted clean in our lights, and the blanket had that dark, heavy look of fabric that's been used recently, not something left to rot for years. It was the first horror detail that really registered, though I didn't have those words for it then, proof that somebody besides bored kids still came here, sat here, watched this exact patch of woods in the quiet. We told ourselves it was just some hunter's unofficial blind or a homeless person's resting spot and squeezed through the window anyway. Inside, the church smelled like rotten wood, cold dirt, and that particular mustiness that only comes with buildings left to themselves too long. The first floor had been gutted sometime before we were even born. There were no pews, no aisles, no altar, just an open space where the floor had been ripped out, leaving a wide expanse of compacted earth and splinters. In the center yawned a hole where a stairwell led down into the basement. The beam from my flashlight caught on graffiti scribbled along the walls. Names, dates, crude drawings layered over old, flaking paint that hinted at where the altar and windows might have once been. We moved toward the stairs, boots scuffing the dirt, dust kicking up around our ankles. The stairs themselves were concrete, chipped at the edges, slick with damp. We filed down single file, our lights converging on the doorway at the bottom. The basement opened into a large room first, with 2 other doorways leading off from it. Only one of those rooms still had an actual door, a heavy wooden thing that hung crooked on its hinges. The main room was scattered with leftover furniture, broken chairs, a busted couch with its stuffing spilling out like cotton guts, a metal folding table missing one leg propped in the corner. It looked the same as the last time we'd been there, and that familiarity emboldened us. Someone put a little speaker on the table and started playing music low enough that it sounded more like a heartbeat than a song. We passed around a cheap bottle one of the twins had swiped from someone's older brother, laughing too loudly, the echo making us all shush each other in between. For a while, nothing happened. It was just adolescence in a place we didn't belong, enjoying that feeling. Then my flashlight drifted toward the far wall and picked up something that hadn't been there before, at least not that I remembered. On a narrow shelf hammered into the bricks sat 3 glass jars, each one labeled with black marker dates, just month and year, and filled with something dark and murky. They were lined up carefully, evenly spaced. A coil of rope hung from a nail above them, neatly wound, and below that on the floor sat a metal bucket that smelled faintly of bleach. That combination, jars labeled like specimens, rope, cleaning chemicals in an abandoned church basement, jammed together in my head in a way that felt wrong, like Wed stumbled across the edge of someone else's routine. No one said much about it. We just avoided shining our lights on that side of the room anymore. The music stuttered and cut off, and that was when the door to the side room slammed shut with a force that echoed off the low ceiling. The sound was so loud and sudden I literally jumped. For a split second I thought one of us had done it, bumped it by accident. But everyone was in the main room, frozen where they stood, wide-eyed and silent. The air felt heavier, thicker. The six of us stared at the closed door, then at each other, and in an instant you could tell who was ready to bounce and who wasn't. Mara, Kayla, and Travis were halfway up the stairs before any of us could say a word, their footsteps pounding, flashlights bouncing wildly. That left me, Liam, and Jenna in the basement, pretending we weren't as scared as we actually were. Some mix of bravado and curiosity took over. We waited, listening, the silence buzzing with the last echo of that slam. Nothing. No movement, no voices, just the drip of water somewhere behind the wall and the soft hiss of our breathing. Finally, we moved as a group toward the closed door. The handle was cold under my fingers. I pushed it open, and our light spilled into a small, narrow room. The first thing my beam hit was an old wooden dresser pushed up against the far wall. A tall mirror bolted to the top. The glass in the mirror was cracked in a spider web pattern radiating from one point, distorting anything it reflected. Across that broken surface, smeared in uneven streaks, was something dark, reddish-brown. At first I told myself it was old paint, or rust, or something left over from before the place was abandoned. But when I stepped closer, I saw the way it glistened in the beam, not fully dried, like it had been put there not long before we arrived. I didn't have to touch it to know it was still slightly tacky. The realization crawled up my spine. Whatever that stain was, it was fresh. That was horror detail number 2 for me, knowing with absolute clarity that someone had been in that tiny room very recently doing something they didn't want anyone else to understand. On top of the dresser, leaning against the cracked mirror, sat a black and white photograph in a chipped frame. It showed a woman in a wedding dress standing in front of what looked like an old church, smiling at the camera. But the longer I stared, the less joyful that smile looked, like it was pressed onto her face instead of rising from it. The background was just out of focus enough that I couldn't tell if the building behind her was this church or somewhere else, and that ambiguity made it worse. The three of us hovered there, the air stale in our lungs, each of us probably trying to decide if this was some edgy art project, a leftover from long before, or something darker. My brain was still working on explanations when another sound cut through. A slight scrape, like a chair leg or a shoe sliding across concrete, coming from the room we had just left, the main room. It was soft, but in the tight space of that basement, it might as well have been a gunshot. The smell of cigarette smoke drifted in behind it, faint but unmistakable. And that detail, more than anything, snapped something in me. None of us smoked. We hadn't smelled it before. That meant someone else was down there with us, in the basement, in the dark. We backed out of the small room, our lights jittering on the walls. As my beam swept across the floor of the main room, it caught on a battered mattress tucked half behind some old furniture, one I swear hadn't been there the last time. The blanket on top was rumpled but recently used, and next to it sat a coffee can overflowing with cigarette butts, one of which still had a faint curl of smoke rising from its tip. The heat from the ember glowed dull red before fading out. That was horror detail number 3, realizing we weren't just intruding on an empty building, but on someone's hidden living space. Someone who might be standing in the shadows at that exact moment, watching 3 dumb teenagers hover in the middle of their secret basement. I don't remember who moved first. One second we were frozen. The next we were running for the stairs, all 3 at once, our footfalls overlapping. As we bolted up, I heard something behind us, maybe a cough, maybe a breath, Maybe just the squeal of an old board shifting, but it sounded human enough to make me want to crawl out of my own skin. We exploded up into the shell of the church, our beams jerking across bare studs and broken windows. The path back to the side window felt twice as long as before. We scrambled out into the cold night air, lungs burning, hearts hammering in our throats. Outside the fence, the road lay empty and silent. The woods pressed close and dark. Mara and the others were already on the far side, faces pale in the flashlight glow. No one said a word as we climbed, scraped our palms, and dropped to the gravel on the other side. We just started walking fast back toward the car. For some reason, I turned back once when we were almost to the bend in the road. The church sat hunched on its little patch of land, that broken bell tower window still a square of darkness against the sky. In the weak wash of our flashlights and the dim spill from the moon, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the side window Wed used to climb in, just a darker shape in the dark, motionless, watching us leave. Even then, I didn't think ghost. I thought person. Somebody with a face I couldn't see and intentions I really did not want to know. Maybe it was just a trick of light and fear and the power of suggestion. I still don't know. After that night, we never went back there as a group. The story of the church became one of those half-joking, half-serious legends we told at bonfires, always editing out the parts that made us feel too vulnerable. Life moved on. People graduated, scattered, got jobs, had kids. Years later, when I was in my late 20s and back in town for a while after a breakup and a job that didn't work out, I found myself driving those old roads again. One cold afternoon, I took the turn toward that hollow more out of muscle memory than conscious choice. I wanted to see if the church was really as bad as my brain remembered or if time had dramatized it. When I reached the dead end, there was nothing there. The fence was gone. The clearing scraped clean. The foundation of the church melted into a flat rectangle of disturbed earth and scattered gravel. Someone had demolished it completely and left the space like a missing tooth in the jaw of the hill. For a long moment, I just sat in my car with the engine idling, staring at the emptiness where that building used to be, feeling something like grief and relief tangled up together. On my way back, I stopped at the little gas station near the mouth of the hollow, the one that doubled as a gossip hub for the older locals. Inside, a bulletin board by the door was layered with old flyers, yard sale notices, and faded missing pet posters. Tucked almost out of sight near the edge was a yellowing newspaper clipping about a transient man the sheriff's department had arrested years back for kidnapping and assault in a neighboring county. The article mentioned, almost as an aside, that had been known to camp in abandoned structures, particularly old churches and schoolhouses, often leaving when complaints about smoke or strange lights came in from nearby residents. There was no mention of our church specifically, no date that lined up perfectly with the night burned into my memory, but reading it was like having someone gently place a name tag on a shadow. It didn't answer anything for sure, but it didn't make me feel crazy either. I still think about that place sometimes, about the jars on the shelf, the fresh streaks on the cracked mirror, the mattress in the corner, and the smell of smoke in the air, about how easily a dare can overlap with someone else's secret, dangerous life without you realizing you've crossed a line. I'm grateful we got to go home that night with nothing worse than shaking hands and stories to tell. Not everyone who walks into the wrong space at the wrong time gets that kind of ending. If you've ever explored an abandoned place and felt that awful shift from "this is fun" to "we shouldn't be here," or if you know anything about how these old churches and buildings out in the Appalachians end up with histories no one writes down, I'd honestly be curious to hear it in the comments. Sometimes knowing other people have brushed up against the same kind of darkness makes those old memories feel a little less like mine to carry alone.